Hello, welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name's Aaron Woodrick. I'm the Director of the Domestic Policy Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I want to thank our audience for joining us today. We've got a very exciting webinar in store for us today, talking about a new book, which has been put out by Peter MacKinnon, who's the President Emeritus of the University of Saskatchewan, and the book is entitled Canada in Question, Exploring Our Citizenship in the 21st Century. So I want to welcome Peter to talk about that. And also joining us to talk about the book, we have Laurie Turnbull, who's Director of the School of Public Administration and an Associate Professor of Political Science at Dalhousie University. Welcome, Laurie. And of course, last but not least, Ken Coates, Distinguished Fellow and Director of the Indigenous Policy Program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I want to thank you all very much for joining me today. I guess the first thing, we've got a lot of questions that have been submitted, a lot of interest in this book, but I wanted to start by putting to Peter, perhaps the most obvious question is, why did you write this book? Why now? What was the inspiration behind it?
Well, thank you very much, Aaron. I wrote the book because I have growing concerns about the future of our country. My sense is that there are centrifugal forces that are acting upon our citizenship that may undermine our sense of what it means to be Canadian. Just to give you a quick example, you may remember that a few years ago, the Halifax Chronicle Herald apologized for the Canadian flag and by implication for the country over which it flies. It was the latest in a long line of apologies, but it was surprising because it came on Canada Day when most Canadians, I think, appreciate their good fortune to live in this country. With respect to the centrifugal forces themselves or the issues, I think there are a number of them. Identity politics, more focused on group identity than on broader affiliations, including citizenship. The social media, I think, aggravates that. Certainly it accompanies it. The rise of populism, the decline of Enlightenment values, new generations, by the way, of Indigenous scholarship that are less compatible with the idea of Canadian citizenship. And of course, the East-West divide. This has been written about by University of Moncton's Richard Sayant in a book provocatively titled A Tale of Two Countries, the Demographic and Resources Divide at the Ottawa River. And of course, our Canadian institutions and the loss of trust. And I cite in particular, with respect to the Canadian institutions, the comments of our Prime Minister, basically dismissing the parliament that he leads as founded upon colonialism, racism, and systemic racism, ignoring, by the way, or at least not referencing the hundreds upon hundreds of years of evolution in the interests of democracy of the Westminster tradition, loss of trust in institutions, failure to reform them. These are all the centrifugal forces, Aaron, that I think are at work in the country.
Well, suffice to say, you've touched on a few things in a single book here. So we're going to try and unpack as many of these things as we can over the next hour. And I want to start with a question about identity politics. So maybe get your thoughts, Peter, and then we can get to Laurie and Ken as well. You know, in the book, you discuss dimensions of citizenship and note that Canada has always been an unlikely country, forged on compromise, but we've been a fairly successful country nonetheless. So I guess my question is whether the rise of identity politics, does this pose an existential threat to Canada due to the lack of a strong central unifying identity, as opposed to what were historically regional and linguistic identities?
Well, I don't think the issue so much is there a strong kind of national identity and what is its place in relation to regional identities. I think the feeling that underlay the work that I did is that, look, most Canadians must feel attached to the country for the country to thrive. And so that, in my view, was one of the key questions. How do Canadians really feel about the country? And I think that there is significant evidence, and it may be a residual strength, I hope it continues, that in fact most Canadians feel strongly about the country. Most Canadians feel positively about the country. And so how they respond to and react to the centrifugal forces that I mentioned is a topic of great interest.
Okay. Laurie, your thoughts?
Sorry, I hesitated to figure out how to unmute myself. So thank you very much for the question. And I'd also like to thank Peter for writing this book. I don't know of very many people, in fact, I don't think I know anybody else who would be able to write a book like this that takes into account so many different arguments, points of view, scholarly sources, and even issues themselves, right? I think Peter has done a marvelous job of capturing very different approaches to the challenges that we're facing in Canada now. And so I just want to congratulate Peter for putting this volume out, and to U of T Press for publishing it as well. Like, to me, Canada has always dealt with identity politics, right? And some of it is on a regional lens, some of it is linguistic, some of it is as we go on, gendered, some of it is demographic, and I think increasingly based on where you are in the economy. We're even seeing some of that, which we didn't see historically in Canada. And obviously, one of the most pressing challenges facing the country is Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. And so we have ways of relating to one another that are incredibly profound in this country. And they aren't necessarily always tied to the country overall, right? Like, sometimes the way we relate is to a local community, to an identity community that we feel more close to. And so then when you think about it from that perspective, what is it that makes Canada when people are attaching to very different types of identity? There's nothing wrong with that, but is there something left that makes us all a country? And so I think it's important to ask that kind of question. And it's a big part, I think, of the reconciliation conversation is, even if we have different experiences, is there a common starting point? Is there a common set of values? Is there a safe space for us all to talk? That's a big part of it, I think. And so then when we talk about reconciliation, we're talking about truth and reconciliation. Do we understand a common truth? Are we getting toward that? A lot of that is based on knowledge and accepting, what really happens, as opposed to, what you may have been told throughout your life. And so I'm not doing a great job of explaining this, but ultimately I think identity politics has always been a thing in Canada. What's really important for us to talk about, I think, is the strength of the values and institutions that hold us together. And so Peter's right. If people don't see themselves as being connected to the country, it's not going to work. It doesn't mean that raising the Canada flag is important to you. Or maybe it does mean that, but it doesn't have to mean that for everybody. It means, what are the things that make you feel that being a Canadian and being part of Canada, that stuff is important. Do you believe in the institutions that govern us? Do you think that they are going to spit out the right results at the end of the day? Do you believe in the people who hold public office? Do you trust them enough to be able to make decisions that make sense to people? And I think that's where we're seeing some tension these days. There is a significant breakdown in the trust of Canadian politicians and institutions. And I would argue that there are some responsibility on the part of some elected officials, to the extent that they are not acting as appropriate and responsible custodians of the institutions that they have come to occupy, and that people should always hold those offices and institutions with a high degree of humility. So I'll park it there for now, because I'm very interested in what Ken has to say, and I don't want to take up too much time, but thank you.
Ken, over to you. You're on mute, Ken.
Peter's a brave person, and he's written a very brave book. And quite frankly, I think he's touched, I think Peter wrote this in a somewhat solitary sense. He was watching his country that he loves so much sort of come to pieces a little bit. But he's actually touched on the zeitgeist of Canada. This theme that Peter's talking about, he is articulating something that other people haven't been able to articulate as well. And then there are a lot of people thinking, what's going on? What's wrong with our country? And Peter's come back and looked at this very carefully and said, I think I've seen what it is. I grew up in the 1960s, 1970s at a time of what we called limited identities. J.M.S. Careless's wonderful description of how Canadians were sort of saw themselves as more than one thing. And I used to describe myself for years, probably still do, as a Western Canadian nationalist, incredibly powerfully passionate Canadian, but also a really strong Western Canadian. I think Canada does not work very well for Western Canada, doesn't work equitably. If I was raised in the Maritimes, I would have been there. Probably a Laurie does. You look and say, Canada doesn't work very well for the Maritimes either, right? And I think we have this limited identities crisis that's actually very, very systematic and very, very serious. And so I'd put it this way. I think Peter has really captured the zeitgeist of the country right now, that in fact, we're tearing our country down bit by bit. We find fault with it. What we actually do not have is a passionate sense of what Canada is. So if I ask my students, say, what do you like best about Canada? They describe, well, we have a national healthcare system, which is really a way of putting down the United States and patting ourselves on the back for something that's not even the top 20 in the world in terms of the effectiveness of a public healthcare system. So if you're saddling your identity around a healthcare system that doesn't work very well, then my gosh, there's not much of a country there. We do not have enough people who care passionately about the country. And so you devolve down into identity issues, small issues, regional issues, local issues, and the Canada disappears. That's the part I think Peter's touched on, and certainly one I share with him very, very strongly.
Great comments. I want to talk a little bit about institutions, Peter, and you know, Laurie had touched on this as well in terms of there being a loss of trust, the loss of faith amongst a lot of Canadians. You know, whether it's for the right outcome or just fair outcomes. I think a lot of Canadians will understand that they might not always get their way in a country where we have disagreements, but just a feeling that there's fair and equal treatment of everyone. In terms of ensuring that our institutions are adaptable and can sort of withstand these populist currents, are there any things in particular you would point to that could change or that could give us a better chance of withstanding this loss of trust?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. First of all, with respect to the institutions, and this has been written about very well by Donald Savoy. And he has pointed to some of the institutional frailties. A parliament that has been unreformed for a very long time, a cabinet that is kind of more a focus group for the prime minister, and this is his view, more a focus group for the prime minister than it is a national decision-making body. We have long-standing issues. We know that with the Senate, some of them perhaps addressed, but many of them still outstanding. So these are challenges. They're compounded by the country's relatively poor, at least among the most advanced nations in the world, economic performance. But what's really, really troubling beyond the institutional frailties is this lack of trust. And it has been documented and it has been affirmed that right across the board, there is a decline of trust in our institutions. And that is a very serious problem. What do we do about that? How do we recover that trust? It's not a short-term or immediate prospect, but I think the only way is to tackle some of the institutional issues and with a view to reforming them in the hope that along with that will come improved trust.
Ken, I want to go to you next, and I want to play devil's advocate a bit here. When we talk about the loss of trust, what if some people argue that it's really just a partisan thing? For example, you're in Western Canada. It's no secret that a lot of folks in Western Canada take a different view on a lot of issues than we see in Central Canada. So is it simply a matter of changing the government and getting a government that Western Canadian, they're doing things that Western Canadians, more of them, would like to see? Or is it deeper than that? Is there something more serious afoot?
I think, Aaron, that it actually is very much something more serious afoot. Because, yes, there's partisanship. There always has been. You know, Canada was a country completely constructed on compromise. Glorious Nova Scotia had nothing to do with British Columbia in 1871. They compromised to sort of create something, and you hope it sort of holds together. We are brilliant at compromise. We have held a country together that had no reason to stay together, right? But let me use one example. one of the reasons we don't have trust, we don't talk to each other anymore. We don't hear each other anymore. Social media, Peter mentioned this in passing. Social media is destroying democracy at 100 levels. It might be creating it in some other ways because it does empower people in some interesting ways, but we have no common ground. If you look at the number of people who watch the CBC, those of people of my age grew up on Knowlton Nash. We grew up on Barbara Frum. We grew up with this national experience where we could go to work the next day and say, did you see the National last night? Did you see the Journal? Today, you cannot have that conversation. 325,000 people watch the CBC national news every night, according to the last data that I saw. That's a fraction of the people in this country. We have no common conversation. Our political parties are now bribery-based parties. How much money can you give me? I give you more. I'll promise you this. I'll promise you free housing. I'll give you a free car, right? So it's not about asking Canadians to believe in something. I don't think we have a common set of values and a common set of beliefs. They're kind of down there on the soil. We aren't bringing them up. And so then it becomes then, to put it back to Peter, I think it's a crisis of leadership. That I think we actually don't have leaders who really believe in the country. And so they go after, individual political groups or votes in particular blocks that actually can help them stitch together a parliamentary majority or at least a minority government. And that's not a comment on the Liberals. It's a comment on all the political parties and, quite frankly, at all levels. So I think we need to be frank about what's actually happening to our world. It's actually very nervous making for the future of democracy.
Yes, and a challenge to places far beyond Canada. But Laurie, I mean, we talk about institutions and reforming them. You mentioned that earlier, that identity politics, we've always had them. But to Ken's point, if we're now in a world where we a lot of people, we don't even have a common reference point anymore. We don't even consume the same media. We have this great fragmentation, if you will. Is it realistic to think that we can get our institutions to somehow accommodate different groups of people who don't even have the same truths, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about Ken's use of the word compromise, and I think that's really important, because when we think about what compromise means, it means nobody gets everything that they want. It means everybody understands the importance of trade-off.
Mm-hmm.
And it means that everybody believes in a common project. And so you're not insisting on everything you want, right? You know that you've got to give some to get some, and there's a reason that we're all doing this, and it all makes sense to everybody, and we're all getting something out of it. I think one other word that I want to put in that sphere, right, like, which I think is related to that concept of compromise, but it's not quite the same thing, and that is consensus. And so, do we have a common understanding of what our values are? And are we able to take some sense of common project and a common buy-in around what we're all doing? And then there's an assumption that, okay, we agree on these sort of common bases of things. We might disagree on these other things, but there's at least some sort of core that keeps us going. And I can think of, like, to take the question back to your comment on institutions, I think that that's been a big part of the consensus in a country like Canada. And it has to be for a democracy to work. You need consensus on democratic institutions. You need to agree on the rules of the game. Right. And I think now we see political machines, political actors who are making careers for themselves by fundamentally taking issue with the rules of the game. And so someone like Donald Trump is the obvious example. Right? I am going to take a run at the ties that bind us. I am going to, whip up the kind of rhetoric that will be necessary, that will make people question everything that they always took for granted, in a way that they think, to the point that this is against me somehow. The institutions that claim to represent me are actually trying to make a fool out of me. Someone like Pierre Poilievre in the Bank of Canada. He is running a campaign on the Bank of Canada and the legitimacy of a national currency. And that's how much he thinks that people don't trust our institutions. And he's making quite a play for the leadership of the Conservative Party. And so those are the types of things that I think we have to be really mindful of, right? Like, as a country, as a set of institutions, we have a lot of work to do. And part of the beauty of Westminster systems is their ability to adapt to things. But when you have people who decide that they've got something to gain by really twisting the public narrative against these institutions because they can harness that distrust in a way that works for them, we really need to be calling that out, I think, for what it is.
Yeah, fair enough observation. And I think there's a lot of debate over the cause and effect there, right? On the one hand, yes, the politicians are going to, sort of stoke the flames. I think that's cause for concern. The other question is, why is there that level of distrust in the first place? Why is it even viable for some of these politicians to make that play in the first place? I think that's something else to reflect on. Peter, I wanted to ask you too, is that in your book, you talk about what's going on in our universities, in our institutions of higher learning. And you observed a pretty important distinction that I don't think a lot of people made between different ways of thinking and learning, so different sort of approaches and viewpoints, versus what you call different ways of knowing. And so you argue that the former is, of course, reasonable. People come to the table with different experiences and different frameworks. But the latter, sort of arguing that there's different ways of knowing facts and things, that's actually quite divisive and anti-intellectual. So could you sort of maybe unpack that a bit more and explain why you think that's been happening?
Well, again, that's a great question. I think it's part and parcel of the identity politics that we've seen. Consider for a moment that argument. There are different ways of knowing. And one could infer from that, for example, the Enlightenment value of reason is one way of knowing. But there are potentially other ways of knowing that emanate from different features, different factors, different identities, different sources. But once you begin to talk about different ways of thinking about events, once you go from that to different ways of knowing, then I think you get into some potentially treacherous terrain. And it is the idea that, well, you have your way of knowing, I have mine. You have your truth, I have mine. When we think about these things in that way, there's not very much to talk about, is there? If you have your truth and I have mine. In other words, we've gone from different ways of thinking about events and the importance, and we all know it, of incorporating many different views into the cauldron from which we draw inferences. But to go from there to, different ways of knowing, some of which may emanate from non-enlightened ways of thinking about this, then I think we're getting into treacherous territory.
Laurie, I wanted to get your thoughts on that and whether you see a parallel here, different ways of knowing with this sort of lack of trust in institutions. So in other words, we could disagree about interpretations of events, but we should be able to agree on, the objectivity of an event having occurred.
Yeah. I mean, oh boy, like I think that's such a complicated and fascinating question that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about and some of the challenges that we see not only in Canadian democracy, but in other democracies as well. I think when we talk about different ways of knowing, I think that we absolutely have different ways of knowing. We have different ways of learning. We have different ways of creating records of things. We have different ways of remembering and acknowledging and internalizing and creating contacts with people. All of that is different ways of knowing, and absolutely we have different ways. I remember having a fascinating conversation with a colleague of mine at Dalhousie who is Indigenous, and she was telling me about the importance of two-eyed seeing, which I learned so much from her about that. And it is a different way of knowing. And I think that when we are thinking about how we make knowledge and how we remember history, it's important for us to be inclusive in how we know. I think that's very, very important. And it's part of the reconciliation process. I also think that sometimes when people talk about different ways of knowing, they really talk about different ways of seeing truth versus fiction.
Right.
And so sometimes I find myself getting irritated when people use words like misinformation and disinformation when we actually mean lies. And using those words has a way of downplaying the harm that can be caused by a falsehood. And so sometimes when people talk about different ways of seeing and knowing, and you have your truth and I have mine, I think I completely understand what Peter is saying. And it's very dangerous because people claim this is a way for people to avoid truth. That's a completely different thing from having different cultural ways of knowing. This other thing is about looking something in the face and saying that's red when you can see it's blue.
Right.
And that's extremely harmful because we end up with no common ground because everything is subject to debate. Well, that's not what I saw, and so it's really dangerous, and it's how democracies are particularly vulnerable to falsehood.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Ken, maybe you can pick up on that theme. I mean, is this a case of sort of legitimate disagreements in interpretation being hijacked, for, as Laurie says, to have people just deny things that they don't like?
Well, it's not just denying things they don't like, it's being incredibly impolite about how you deny things, right? So I've known Peter for a very, very long time. In his role as president of the University of Saskatchewan, he was unrelenting in his support of free speech and open conversation, and in fact, very vigorous debate, including about his own activities, including about his role as president. That was something he invited, and we all should invite. So here's the thing to remember about universities. They succeed best when they are an irritation to the status quo, when there are so many good ideas coming out that the people who've had the sort of the run of the power for 100 years or 200 years or 1,000 years are sort of saying, well, you're challenging my worldview. That's what universities are for. It's that sort of poking and prodding and coming up with new ideas. It's when you get to the point where somebody says, you should not talk about that. Stop talking about that. Don't say your other viewpoint. That's where the universities grind to a bit of a halt. And that's where you get this sort of stuff where people think that they're about indoctrination on the right wing or the left wing, that you're indoctrinating people in capitalism on the one hand, or that you're sort of bringing in critical race theory, and that's horrible. Well, actually, neither are wrong. There's a place for critical race theory in terms of understanding how society operates. There's a place for understanding capitalism in terms of understanding how the economy could and should work. These are all really important parts of the discussion. It's the shutting down of the debate that makes people lose trust in institutions. It isn't the existence of the debate. So we have to have those rigorous conversations about what's true, what's not true, new interpretations. I'll finish with an observation that goes back to reconciliation. In the 1960s and 1970s, people thought residential schools were a wonderful illustration of government generosity. They actually believed that this is the government providing free education, housing, a clean bed, blah, 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 blah. All that stuff that sort of the dominant society thought the Indigenous communities didn't do for themselves, which was not nonsense. But they had this view of residential schools that way. And it took us 30 years to hear what Indigenous students were saying, what Indigenous graduates and their parents were saying about how disruptive they were. I grew up in the Yukon, right? And the kids in the schools were talking about how horrible they were. They were complaining about the teachers and the principals and the priests and the nuns all the time, and nobody heard them. And then all of a sudden we have this sort of moment where our eyes open up, right? It took 30 years of people being upset about that negative interpretation of residential schools. For now it's the status quo, where if you want to get in trouble, say that residential schools had some good elements, or there are some constructive parts to it, and that's you start getting, well, you can't talk about those kinds of things, right? So it's a really good part of universities to stir those debates. It's always a harm to society when we try to stop them.
Yeah, good points. Now, I know we regrettably don't have any Indigenous scholars on the panel, but I know a couple of folks on the panel have a lot of experience in academic matters in Indigenous policy in this country. So, Peter, in your book, you touched on, you have a chapter on Indigenous people and citizenship, and you talk about some of what you see as the major barriers to reconciliation. So I guess a very simple question there. Do you think these barriers are greater today than 20 years ago, or have prospects for reconciliation improved?
Well, I argue in the book, and I believe that in fact there is a strong Canadian commitment now to reconciliation. Different views, no doubt, about that, but still in the context of a commitment to see reconciliation continue and grow. And we know that we have more work in front of us than we have done to date. The kind of issue that intrigued me in writing the book is that there seems to me, at least, to be a new generation of Indigenous scholarship that pays less attention to reconciliation than perhaps we might like to see. Turns away, if you like, from indeed not only citizenship, but this scholarship turns away from liberalism, the rule of law, the market economy. I think that challenge has been articulated by one writer who argues that liberalism, the rule of law, and capitalism are hostile to interdependence and by implication to reconciliation. And by another scholar who has written that in order to build a truly decolonized set of relationships in Canada, we need to, quote, sink the ship. Now, what does that mean? Maybe it means something less apocalyptic than I interpret it to mean, but I think this is at least a feature of a new generation of Indigenous scholarship that perhaps turns aside from the idea of citizenship, if it was ever aligned with it. And I think that makes our task ahead more difficult.
Laurie, your thoughts on the prospects for reconciliation?
What are my thoughts on it?
Sorry, I'm going to Laurie now. Sorry.
Oh, good. Yeah.
So we know that this federal government has made reconciliation with Indigenous peoples as one of its, at least ostensibly, its top priorities. And the Prime Minister has woven that into the fabric of the mandate letters that he sent to ministers since day one of his tenure as Prime Minister. And so there's that kind of political commitment to it. There have also been, I think what is really is going to put this in focus is the tangible indicators of progress. And so something, for instance, like the boil water advisories, the government made a commitment to eliminating all of those by a certain date. It didn't meet that commitment, but it made progress. And so is that, obviously, that is progress that's extremely important, but does it help to build trust with Indigenous communities? From their perspective, does that feel like a broken promise, which actually makes things worse? Or does it feel like, no, the government, it wasn't perfect, but there was progress made that was really important? What else can be done? I think at this point, there have been some things that you could hold up as progress. There have been things you can hold up as setbacks. I think, not to politicize the conversation, but I think it was unfortunate that the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation became a conversation about why the Prime Minister was in Tofino. And I do believe that that's his fault, his responsibility. And it sort of pushes the issue around reconciliation as being something that there needs to be tangible progress on, and not, the symbolic pieces around, yes, this is going to be an important day for the country. And then there's a sense that, well, is it really? And what does that mean to you? And so I think one thing is that there's definitely a sense of public consciousness around this being a significant issue that everybody has to take ownership of. I think there is a lot of movement on that. And I think as somebody with a child in elementary school, there's even, curricular change around, again, going back to that consciousness that things happened in this country and we all need to know that. And so those sorts of things, I think, are tangible progress.
Sorry, Aaron, were you passing it to me? You were on.
Yes.
So I'll pick up on this wonderful observation so far and offer some quick comments. I'm actually joining the call today from the Yukon. And if you want to find out if reconciliation works, come to the Yukon. But if you want to find out the reconciliation is only a sort of half-filled promise, come to the Yukon. So there's amazing accomplishments here. And one small community here in the territory had 4 people die of fentanyl-related deaths in the months of January alone. Right, so you can find great progress as modern land claim settlement, an umbrella final agreement, self-government, development corporations, reconciliation. The transformations in my hometown are unbelievable, but not finished. And so reconciliation is not an event, it's a process, and it's going to go on for a very, very long time. recognize that First Nations continue, and into a Métis, continue to work with inside Canada. They actually do believe in Canada. They go to the courts. If you go to the courts, what are you doing? You're trusting in the legal process to produce justice. What an interesting concept, right? So absolutely, the First Nations are engaging with that, with Parliament. They engage with the police forces. They engage all over the place. So the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are doing that as well. Third point, we recognize that when we slow down reconciliation, the burden of that, the cost of that, falls almost 100% on Indigenous communities. So if we're slow in getting the water going, it's actually a 70-year-old First Nation person from northern Manitoba who has to carry water 400 yards back to their house every day. So when we're slow in doing the job we set out to do, the Indigenous people pay the price for that. But I ask this one question. I don't disagree with Peter that there are some very angry Indigenous academics. Why are Indigenous people not more angry? Why are they not more frustrated? We always say, we had Oka and we have Caledonia. And my question is, why not 40 of those? Look at what's happening in Indigenous communities. Look at the poverty. Look at the dislocations. Look at the cultural loss. Look at the disappearance of languages. Most languages in Canada will disappear in the next 20 years unless we do something heroic about them. And the Indigenous communities are trying. So my question really is why there isn't more anger rather than less. Right. And I think, that frustration we see in the academia is because those scholars go back to the communities and see hurting people. And they're using their bully pulpit at the university to say, we need to shake things up. We are shaking things up, but because we're Canadians, we do it too gently.
Yes. Sorry, Laurie, did you have something to say?
The only thing that I would be remiss if I didn't mention this is that another, a wonderful story is in Nova Scotia. And the deal for, and this was led by Chief Terry Paul, and it is the deal for a group of Mi'kmaq First Nations that are partnering to buy Clearwater seafood. And so there are really great stories when you get wonderful people around the table who want to work together. And I would be remiss as a Nova Scotian if I didn't raise that.
Fair enough. If I can, I got to just take one more question from my list and then we'll go. We've got a lot of questions, a lot of interest in this, so I'll take some audience questions. But I want to pivot from First Peoples to more recent arrivals and talk a little bit about immigration and the role of immigration. Obviously, the majority of Canadians are either immigrants or descendants from immigrants. We've seen sort of across the Western world in recent years a backlash against immigration in a lot of places. Canada seems to have escaped this relatively unscathed, but there's some evidence too that perhaps the sort of cross-partisan consensus around immigration is actually a lot more fragile than we realize. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that, Peter, whether Canada is also at risk of a similar type of backlash against immigration.
Well, we haven't seen it yet. Of course, there are from time to time voices that emerge that are skeptical about or negative about immigration. But in fact, most of the polls that have been conducted over the years, there's some variability, of course, but there continues to be wide recognition within the country of the positive features that immigration brings. And indeed, this past year, we've seen the numbers increase. What I think is important to Canadians as a whole is an understanding that the processes that are in place make sense and are orderly, but I don't think that there is a really negative sense yet in this country. Is it possible that it will develop? I see no signs of it developing. I don't see the kind of divisiveness over the issue of immigration that we see in the United States. Nor do I see it playing out in the area of refugees. I think that, again, it's well documented that people who come as refugees bring a lot to the country and over time contribute enormously, not only to this country, but to the countries from which they come. There was a major report done by The Economist on that. And so I think my answer is this is not something that I'm particularly worried about in Canada.
How about you, Ken? Do you agree? Sorry, you're on mute.
I agree with the general thrust, but I'd add a couple of things just to reinforce that. Number one, the answer to the question, is Canada a racist country? Do you experience Canada as a racist country? The only group where a majority of the people said it was a racist country were Caucasians, which is ironic. New Canadians actually said it was not. And their comments were, when they asked people, what are you talking about? They said, well, have these people not been anywhere else? Like, if you think Canada's a racist country, have you not been in other places where they really experience that? That's number one. Number two, and this is disquieting. The second one is, among new Canadians who have been here sort of in the last decade, a disproportionate number are eager to leave the country. That they're finding that Canada is not meeting its needs and their needs and expectations. That we're kind of a nastier country, not to immigrants specifically, but to each other. That it's not a place where there's a lot of consent. Going back to Peter's main point, we're sort of fraying at the edges, and so it's a country that's less, not so much less accommodating to immigrants, less accommodating to each other. And I think that's a really nervous-making point. And the third one, we have to monitor very carefully the economic experience of new Canadians. It's not very good. We bring people over with high expectations, and basically what happens is the parents have to decide to sacrifice their lives for their children. And they have to accept menial, low-paying jobs so their kids can go to university, go to college, go on and get a career, right? That's not what the promise we held out for them. And we've got a real issue, for example, around credentials. You know, wonderfully well-credentialed people in other countries who can't get a job in their field because we don't accept their credentials. So lots of work to be done, but Peter's absolutely right. This country's strength is, in fact, the fact that we do accommodate people from so many parts of the world so comfortably. They see that better than we do as Caucasian Canadians. And I think we need to focus on that.
Okay, and to go to you, Laurie, last on this question, but I also wanted to add, given that you've mentioned this sort of style of politics, the sort of Trump style shatter institution stuff, does this perhaps explain why, even though does the attitude of Canadians towards immigration explain why Pierre Poilievre, even though his style sort of approximates Trump in a lot of ways, on issues like immigration, he's actually very different than Donald Trump in that he's actually been very pro-immigration and talking about giving credentials for immigrants. Is he recognizing that there might be a fundamental difference in the way immigrants are viewed here versus south of the border?
Oh, I think that's right. I think that there is broad and deep support for immigration levels in Canada. And I think there's also a high priority, even if we're not, I was going to say like a high priority on making sure that that's a good experience. And I think that a lot of Canadians would be very disheartened to learn that it's not in a lot of cases, right? That we're not meeting the mark. And that's not, I think that it's part of the Canadian psyche, actually, that we tell ourselves we are a welcoming place. And we are, our arms are open, and this is a big part of who we are as Canadians. But then it's hard for us to hear in some ways that many immigrants come and don't have the kind of experience that they thought they would. And that speaks to some other things that are at play in the country as well. And we hear stories about instances of hate and intolerance and situations that put people in danger. And I think that's also kind of part of the larger conversation we're having around confronting some very uncomfortable and ugly truths about what it's like to be Canada, right? It's not the mythology we tell ourselves about being a welcome place. It doesn't always work that way on a daily basis, unfortunately. But I think, all of the political parties, like if you look at some of the public opinion polling data, there's some differences between partisan supporters around their levels of support for immigration. But from what I can tell, all of the political parties, all of the party leaders understand that this is very important, and they have some commitment to that.
Okay. So we're going to take some audience questions now. There's some interesting ones here. So I want to start with one from Gary. And Peter, this could go in a bunch of different directions, so I'll let you interpret it as you see fit. He asks, can Canada overcome the domination exerted by its 4 city-states, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and Ottawa? So I'm not sure if Gary means the sort of economic and political dominance or perhaps sort of cultural dominance of our cities, but what are your thoughts on that dynamic?
It's a great question. And I don't think I have a well thought out answer to it. I think there is a problem when you have that kind of domination. I think there's also a problem of representation in the country. If the government of the day depends upon the kind of domination to which you refer, then we've got problems. And we saw those particularly following the 2019 election, when there was not a government MP between Winnipeg and Vancouver. That's a huge issue. And so efforts on the part of political parties to appeal more broadly and more widely, and to take very seriously the representation issues when you don't have the governing party represented significantly in substantial parts of the country. That's a very, very serious issue. And I think the political parties themselves have a special obligation to try to overcome that, rather than to capitalize on whatever appeal I think they have in a limited setting, appeal to the country as a whole. I'd be interested in the response of Laurie and Ken to this, because it's a very important question and a very difficult one.
Yeah, maybe we go to you next, Laurie, on that. Is it asking too much of politicians and political parties to look out for the greater good rather than try and play to their existing base and where they know their votes are?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question that hits on a number of things. Like, there is a kind of incentive for politicians who are looking, because they want to win fair, right? That's what they're in the game for. And so they're looking at ways that they can maximize their vote haul, and they're focusing on places that have that huge amount of votes, and it's going to make a big difference. And when we're talking about like an electoral map, and we can look at the 2021 election as an example, where people are, parties go into this election and they're really focusing on the swing ridings, like the ridings that can make a difference between majority or minority, or are you going to get this many seats or that many seats? Like, it becomes very much a transactional exercise and a mathematical exercise around how are you going to win an election, right? And because of our electoral system, which is a whole other conversation, that's how parties are looking at this. There's also a bit of a push and pull around balancing out the urban-rural divide in Canada. And even in Nova Scotia, we can see that the proposed redrawn electoral boundaries map, we're not gaining or losing any seats. We're staying at 11. But the proposed redrawing is absolutely, like, you can see how the concentration of the population inside Halifax and the greater Halifax area is forcing a redrawing of the boundaries that really pulls toward the metro area, so that you have boundaries that are drawn in a way that's kind of long, so that you've got rural and urban in most of the ridings, which creates a very different scenario for the MP trying to represent that riding. But I think that's not a Nova Scotia thing. That's common, across the country, and that's always been the balance in Canada, is to try to maintain some sort of adherence and meaningful representation for both kinds of ridings. But we're seeing that that's becoming more difficult as the population is moving more urban.
That's a great point. And building off that, Ken, is it that part of the problem is structural? Is it becoming winner take all? So there is no incentive to compromise, because if you win, you get everything your way, and the other viewpoint is just sort of shunted to the side.
So it's always been that way in Canada. We've always had a winner-take-all sort of process. It's just the demographics have shifted very dramatically. And the problem in Canada, in one sense, is our electoral boundaries are too fair. They're actually distributed on the basis of rough basis of population, so you end up with, not very many seats in rural areas, and many seats, and many more seats coming in the urban environments, right? So to answer to Gary's question, the answer is I don't think we can overcome this. I think, in fact, the city-states are going to dominate Canadian politics and Canadian economics. But I think there is one way this could happen. Right now, small town and rural Canada does not have a powerful voice. We do not have any particular politicians you say, that is the person who is advocating for rural Canada, for small town Canada. And in fact, what happens is those voices get sucked up inside the political parties. And so within the Liberals, within the Conservatives, and the NDP, you don't ever hear people talking about a rural force or rural transformation or revitalizing small towns. If we do not do something, we will follow what's happening all around the world, which is a mass urbanization process. And we can debate whether that's good or bad. I really favor small towns. I don't, as a personal thing, don't like big cities. But I think as a country, we need both. To put it this way, Aaron, we have 4 of probably the best 30 cities in the world inside Canada. Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, Montreal. These are world-class cities, absolutely world-class cities. Right? We should be extremely proud of that. And we should also be looking and saying, what about those small towns? Let's talk about those as well. And you have them in Nova Scotia, you have them in Saskatchewan, you have them in other provinces and territories. But let's raise those up and make them just as successful in their own right. They are not right now. The innovation effort, the economic effort is overwhelmingly going to the cities. If we don't do this deliberately and consciously, we'll actually just become more, we'll only have 5 or 6 places rather than a much more comprehensive, sort of a nation. And I worry about that a lot.
Absolutely. We got time for a couple more questions here. I want to take this one from Roy. Roy has a question about the education curriculum and how that contributes to what he asks. How does the education curriculum contribute to young Canadians' understanding of their country? Peter, do you see any room for improvement there?
Well, I believe it is the case that young Canadians are not nearly as familiar with their history as you would like to see them be. I think the education in the schools, 1 to 12, I think the education in Canadian history has deteriorated over the last few decades. And I think it is in a sorry state. And I think it should demand attention on the part of those responsible for education, 1 to 12, for curricula. Why don't we have more of a study of Canadian history and more of an understanding of Canadian history through that study? That's a serious question, and I think it demands compelling answers, and I haven't seen any compelling answers on the subject.
Ken, your thoughts?
I think one of the problems is, agree with Peter, that we actually have made Canadian nationalism a bad thing. In fact, the world is trying to make nationalism a bad thing. So I'll put it this way. I'm extremely proud to be a Canadian, and I spend my whole life trying to fix the problems, right? It's not as though I don't know the problems. I really do believe in them very strongly. But in fact, if you look at the curriculum is about tearing Canada down. It goes back to one of Peter's main points. And I don't mean to pick on the Prime Minister. He's just got the bully pulpit right now. But our Prime Minister has done more to demean Canada than any Prime Minister in Canadian history. He talks about us in very negative terms. He did it with the Freedom Convoy. He's done it at the United Nations. He's found fault with Canada in a public way. And you actually look hard for him to say positive things and to indicate a real powerful belief that Canada means something. And I think that I'm seeing the same thing in the Conservative leadership campaign. I think people just ripping Canada apart and talking about all its shortcomings. We happen to have one of the greatest countries in the history of the world. Surely we can come up with something positive to say and to use the education system not to have an unvarnished, true, positive portrait of the country, but to balance it off. We've done great things. We've got some real challenges. Put them both there. Right now, we're on the challenges piece overwhelmingly. And that's not good enough in terms of building a country and building the central piece of Peter's book, building real sense of citizenship.
That's a good point, Ken, although I'd point out that if everything wasn't wrong, then we wouldn't need to change the government, right? Which, of course, is a pretty bog standard opposition tactic. But Laurie, your thoughts?
So I think I'm going to make 2 points. One is that I think it's really important for us to be able to look ourselves in the face as a country and be honest about the things that have happened and not sugarcoat things, and not, because that goes back to the point on being able to be really inclusive and honest about our sense of knowledge, right? Like we have to do that, or else there's always, when it comes to, everybody should be able to be around the table and say the things that they need to say. Well, yeah. And we need to be able to account for things in history that have happened that we may not have represented the way we should have in the past. Education is how that happens. It's a very important in like, as in elementary school, in in high school, in post-secondary, to continue to make room for a safe and honest conversation about what has happened and what we need to do. And I think in a way that doesn't have to be like, communicate some sort of shame about what the country is, but at the same time, an accountability about what the country is. I think that's important. That's important for institutional growth. The other thing I want to say is, because we only have 5 minutes left, Peter, I hope you don't mind that I'm going to take a couple of words out of your mouth here when it comes to some of the points you landed on in your book, which I think are really important. One of those points is that Peter recommends lowering the voting age. I think that is extremely important. We need to acknowledge citizenship in a formal way. People are 16, not 18. That means that there is a coordinated effort to create a citizen out of you, an active citizen who votes and has a responsibility to vote, at the same time as you're still in an education system that is talking to you about what it means to be Canadian. That is an extremely important part of Peter's book that I really hope gets a lot of attention from a panel like this and from others too.
Thank you, Laurie. Well, we're down to the last couple of minutes, so I want to put one last very straightforward question to each of you, and maybe we'll go in reverse order this time. Start with you, Laurie, Ken, and Peter. Are you an optimist? Are you more worried that we are heading on a really dangerous track and it's going to be hard to get off? Or are you an optimist that we can turn things around and this country has better days ahead, Laurie?
I'm an optimist, always. We're smart. We're resilient. We have great technology. We can find different ways of knowing each other and understanding each other. And there's no reason to be pessimistic. There's all kinds of reasons to be optimistic. And I think we also have, more than any other time, we have the tools, we have the technology to, and now that we're hopefully in a post-COVID, moving toward a post-COVID era, we have more opportunity to meet each other, sit down, look each other in the eye, talk honestly. And so I'm optimistic for sure. That's
the kind of pick-me-up we want to hear. Ken, your turn.
Very pessimistic. I've actually never been more worried about the future of the country than I am now. I see thanks, Laurie. I see some forces of disintegration and very few forces of integration. I think we've lost our passion as a nation, and one of the lessons of history is do not take the past as a prelude. It doesn't necessarily, what happened in the past is no guarantee that we stay together, right? So I'm worried about a country that is losing its direction and losing its force. Are we going to fall apart and fall into 1,000 different pieces? No. Are we going to see more and more people leaving the country for greener pastures? Absolutely. So I think I put it this way, Laurie. I agree. I wish I shared your optimism, but I'm going to share the fight with you. I'm going to share the effort to sort of campaign for a country that deserves to flourish. We have a great country here. It can be better, but we have to fight for it. It doesn't happen by natural course.
Well, we've got one pessimist, one optimist. Peter, you're the tiebreaker. No pressure.
Well, I think temperamentally and historically, I have been an optimist, but I'm a heck of a lot more worried today about the future of the country than I was 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
Okay, well, fair enough. There you have it. I want to thank our panelists again today, Laurie Turnbull, Ken Coates, and Peter MacKinnon for joining us. I think it was an outstanding conversation. I'd like to thank our audience, of course, for joining us today. And the book is Canada in Question, Exploring Our Citizenship in the 21st Century by Peter MacKinnon. You can find it, of course, at all fine purveyors of book. Thank you very much again for joining us.
Thanks,
everybody.
Thank you.